The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was not a long letter. 1 page, typed, with the official crest of the British Army stamped at the top in faded blue ink. Corporal Owen Hartley read it twice at the kitchen table in his mother's house in Coventry, then folded it once and placed it flat on the wood beside his tea mug. His mother was upstairs. He did not call to her. He sat for a while and watched the steam rise from the mug and disappear. He had known it was coming. Every man in his regiment had been waiting for something like this since the autumn of 1972, when the bombing campaign had moved from Northern Ireland and arrived on English streets like an uninvited guest that nobody had the power to remove. Owen had been 19 then. He was 24 now, 5 years of service in the Grenadier Guards, and the army had decided he was ready for the most visible duty in the country, standing post outside Buckingham Palace, at a time when standing there carried the very real possibility of dying there. He did not think of himself as a brave man. He thought of himself as a trained one. There was a difference, and his sergeant major, a Scotsman named Callum Brewster, had made that difference plain during Owen's first weeks of drill. Brave men feel the fear and push through it, Brewster had said. Trained men learn to put the fear somewhere else while the job gets done. You are not trying to be heroes. You are trying to be walls. Owen had liked that idea. A wall did not tremble. A wall did not look left when a car backfired on the mall. A wall stood, and by standing, it told the people on the other side of it that the world was still in order, even when it was not. He arrived at Wellington Barracks on a cold morning in January 1973. The briefing room smelled of floor polish and old wood. There were 9 other men in the room, all of them young, all of them wearing the same careful expression of men who had decided not to show whatever they were actually feeling. Owen took a chair near the window and looked out at the parade ground while they waited for the briefing officer. Captain George Alderton was 41 years old and had the kind of face that had stopped recording surprise somewhere in his mid-30s. He walked in without ceremony, set a thin folder on the desk, and looked at the 10 men in front of him for a moment before he spoke. He told them what they already knew first, because clarity mattered even when the facts were familiar. The Provisional IRA had been conducting a campaign of bombings on the British mainland since the previous year. London was a priority target. The palace, the horse guards, the ceremonial routes used by the royal family, and the service personnel assigned to protect those routes and locations were all considered high-value targets. There had been letter bombs. There had been car bombs. There had been intelligence suggesting future operations of greater scale. The men sitting in this room were going to stand post in public, in full ceremonial uniform, at locations that had been publicly named in IRA communications as symbolic targets. He said all of this without raising his voice. Then he said the thing that Owen would carry for the rest of his life. "The enemy wants 2 things from you," Alderton said. "They want you dead, and they want the ones who are not dead to look afraid. If they can put fear on your face, they have won something even without a bomb. A guardsman who flinches, who looks at the crowd the wrong way, who breaks his bearing when he hears a loud noise, tells every person watching that the threat is real. He becomes a broadcast. He becomes their message. You will not be that. Whatever you feel in your body while you stand post, nothing of it will reach your face. Nothing of it will reach your posture. You will be stone, and stone does not react, and that is your weapon, not your rifle, your stillness." Owen wrote none of this down. He kept it in his chest instead, somewhere just below the sternum, where it settled like a smooth, heavy stone. The physical preparation was not new. He had been drilling for years. He knew how to stand for hours without shifting his weight, how to breathe in a controlled way that kept the body oxygenated without any visible movement of the chest, how to hold his eyes fixed at a middle distance that was not quite a stare and not quite a gaze. His instructors called it the 1,000-yard look. It was not aggressive. It was simply absent, a face that had removed itself from the world in front of it, not through weakness but through discipline so complete it had become a kind of armor. What was new was the threat briefing. A separate session, smaller, just Owen and 3 other men selected for the inner cordon. A warrant officer named Philip Graves ran it without pleasantries. He placed photographs on the table. He named individuals. He described methods. He talked about the operational pattern the provisionals had used in Belfast and Derry, and how those patterns had begun migrating to the mainland. He talked about what to look for in a crowd. He talked about the specific vulnerabilities of ceremonial formations, how the fixed positions and predictable schedules of Royal Guard duty created a pattern that a well-organized group could exploit. Owen listened and said nothing. He looked at the photographs on the table. He looked at the faces of men who had decided that the ceremony of the British state was worth attacking, and he thought about what it meant to stand directly in front of something like that and refuse to show that you knew it was there. After the briefing, Philip Graves walked Owen out into the corridor and said something quietly, away from the other men. He said, "I have had soldiers come through this briefing who asked for reassignment afterward. There is no shame in that. This is specific and unusual duty, and not every man is built for it." Owen looked at him and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where do I report in the morning?" Graves nodded once and walked away without another word. Owen's first post was at the eastern sentry box on the forecourt of the palace, facing the crowds that gathered daily at the railings to watch the ceremony they had come from every country in the world to see. On the first morning, there were perhaps 300 people in front of him. Tourists mostly, families with children, people holding cameras the size of small paperbacks, aiming them at his face as though his stillness were the attraction, which, he had come to understand, it was. A woman in a red coat held her daughter up to see him. The girl was perhaps 4 years old. She waved at him with a small, energetic arm. He did not wave back. The girl waved again, more insistently, as though she suspected he had missed it. Her mother said something to her in a language Owen did not recognize. The girl looked at him with a very serious expression, as though she were trying to solve a puzzle. He looked above her head at the middle distance, at the specific empty point in the air that was his post, his job, his whole world for the next 2 hours. He was aware, at the edge of everything, of a car moving along the mall. He tracked it without moving his eyes, the way he had been taught. His pulse did not change. The car passed. He breathed. In the afternoons, back in barracks, the men talked. Some of them found the duty easier than expected. Some found it harder. One man, a guardsman named Kevin Pierce, who had come through training with Owen and who had always been the loudest in any room, was very quiet in those first weeks. Owen noticed but said nothing about it. There was a code among them. You did not name what you were carrying. You carried it. Owen wrote to his mother every Sunday. He told her the duty was going well. He told her London was cold, but the food at the barracks was decent enough. He did not tell her about the threat briefings. He did not tell her that every morning when he dressed in his uniform and prepared to walk out to his post, some part of him conducted a very rapid and very private reckoning with the possibility that this day might end differently from every other day. He did not tell her because there was no word for what he was doing that would make sense to someone who had not sat in that briefing room and heard Captain Alderton's voice say, without drama, that the enemy wanted to put fear on their faces. Instead, he stood his post. He held his stillness. He kept the stone in his chest exactly where it was, and when the tourists photographed his face and later showed the photographs to people at home, what they saw was a young man in a bearskin and red coat who looked as though nothing in the world could move him. That was the point. That was the whole of it. The world outside the railings was frightened. The news was full of it. But the man at the gate looked like he had never heard the word fear, and as long as he kept looking that way, something very important remained true. Not safe, exactly, but standing, unbroken, resolved. Owen Hartley was 24 years old, and he had just learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear do its job. He stood his post. The morning went on. The radio in the guard room crackled at 7:43 in the morning, and nobody moved for a second, because nobody wanted to be the man who had heard it correctly. It was the 20th of July, 1982. Owen Hartley was 33 years old, a sergeant now, with 9 years of this duty behind him. He was in the guard room at Hyde Park Barracks, reviewing the morning rotation schedule with 2 junior guardsmen when the sound came through the radio that none of them had words for in that first instant. It was deep and percussive, and it did not belong to any city sound that a person ever got used to. It came from the direction of the park. Owen was at the door before he had made a conscious decision to move. The sky above the park was wrong. There was a column of dark smoke already building above the tree line, thick and fast, the kind of smoke that meant something structural had gone. His radio crackled again. He heard fragments. South Carriage Drive, cavalry, down. He went back inside and told the two junior men to stay where they were until he had further orders. They looked at him with wide eyes, and he held their gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to make the instructions stick. Then he picked up the phone and began making the calls he had been trained to make in exactly this sequence. What had happened was this. A device packed with 4-inch nails had detonated beneath a blue Ford car parked on South Carriage Drive in Hyde Park, directly in the path of a mounted detachment of the Blues and Royals riding to the changing of the guard at Horse Guards Parade. The explosion killed 4 soldiers. It wounded many more. It killed horses. The nails had traveled in every direction at extraordinary speed and had done what they were designed to do without any interest in the distinction between a man and his animal. Less than 2 hours later, a second device detonated in Regent's Park, beneath the bandstand where the band of the Royal Green Jackets was performing a lunchtime concert. 7 more soldiers died. Owen learned the full picture in pieces across the course of a morning that felt like it lasted several days. He heard names he recognized. He put the names in the stone in his chest and kept moving, because movement was the only rational response available to him. He coordinated. He reported, he relayed, he confirmed. He did not sit down. He did not allow his hands to shake where anyone could see them. His hands were shaking. Inside his gloves, which he kept on because it was easier to keep them on than to take them off and put them back on again, his hands were trembling steadily, the way a drawn bow trembles when the archer holds it at full tension for too long. He knew the feeling. He had developed a relationship with it over 9 years. The knowledge that something terrible was happening and that his face was required to remain perfectly ordinary for the duration. At 9:30, with the second explosion not yet known, Owen was ordered to his post. The morning ceremonies were not cancelled. This was not a failure of judgment. It was a decision, made at a level above Owen's, that the public presentation of normalcy was itself a form of resistance. The Queen's Guard would stand. The routes would be maintained. The ceremony that the enemy had tried to shatter would continue, visibly and deliberately, because to stop it was to give the morning exactly the meaning the bombers had intended it to have. Owen knew this. He agreed with it, in the deep and unsentimental part of himself that had been trained to think in these terms. And he walked out to his post with the smoke still visible in the distance above the park, and he stood in the place he had been standing for 9 years, and he set his face to stone. The crowd that morning was smaller than usual. Some people had heard or felt the blast and had moved away from open spaces by instinct. But there were still people at the railings. There were still cameras. There were still children being held up to look at the tall man in the bearskin who would not blink. A woman near the front of the crowd was crying. She was perhaps 40 years old, a tourist by her clothing, and she was not trying to hide it. She had a husband beside her who had his arm around her shoulder, and she was looking at Owen with an expression that asked a direct question: is it as bad as it sounds? Owen looked above her head. He looked at the specific empty point in the air that was his assigned gaze point, and he did not look at her face. She kept looking at him. He was aware of it the way you are aware of heat from a distance, not through sight, but through something else. She needed him to look frightened so that her own fear would feel appropriate. She needed to see that the world had shifted. He refused her. His stillness was not cruelty. He understood that much clearly. His stillness was the answer to her question. The answer was, the thing that stands here is still standing. That was all it could be. That was all it needed to be. Inside his chest, behind the stone and below the controlled breathing, and beneath everything he had been taught, Owen Hartley was thinking about a man named Gary Copeland. Gary had been in Owen's regiment, a couple of years ahead of him, a man with a gap between his front teeth and a habit of doing impressions of their warrant officers that were accurate enough to be dangerous. Gary had transferred to the Blues and Royals 2 years back. Owen had not seen him since the transfer. He had no way of knowing, standing at his post, whether Gary Copeland was among the 4 who had been on South Carriage Drive that morning. He did not move. He did not look at the smoke. He did not look at the woman who was crying. The post-rotation came and went. Owen was relieved, walked back in, reported, and then found a private corner of the guard room where he stood with his back against the wall for approximately 60 seconds and let his hands shake as much as they needed to. Then he straightened, walked to the duty desk, and asked for the confirmed casualty list. Gary Copeland's name was not on it. Owen noted this without reacting and passed the list back. Later that day, when the full picture had settled and the scale of what had happened was clear across all the news broadcasts, Owen sat in the mess with several other senior NCOs and ate his dinner. The food was unremarkable. Somebody made a remark about the weather. Someone else responded. The conversation moved in small, ordinary steps around the edges of what everyone in that room was actually thinking, which was the same thing every person in every armed forces mess in the country was thinking that evening. What Owen was thinking, specifically, was about the woman at the railings who had been crying. He had not helped her feel better. He had not smiled, had not nodded, had not given her any signal that he saw her or understood her distress. He had given her his absolute and complete refusal to confirm that the world had changed. And the reason he was thinking about her now, hours later, with his hands finally still and his face finally off duty, was because he could not decide whether what he had given her was a gift or a withdrawal. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about how she had looked at him with that question on her face, and how he had answered it by giving her nothing, by being so entirely solid and unmoved that the very quality of his stillness had been the message. The message was, "This still stands. Whatever else is true this morning, the thing you came here to see is still here, still upright, still holding." He decided, slowly and without any particular drama, that it was a gift, not a comfortable one, not the kind of gift a person thanks you for, but the kind that holds a wall up when the wall very much wants to fall. He finished his dinner, he washed his plate, he walked to the bunk room and lay down on his cot and stared at the ceiling in the dark. He had been right to stand. He had been right to hold the face. He had been right to refuse the woman her confirmation of catastrophe, even though catastrophe was exactly what had happened, because if every guard in every post across the city had let the morning show on his face, the meaning of what had been done would have doubled and tripled and spread through the watching world like a fire through dry grass. They had not let it show. None of them had. 9 years of training had stood up on a morning when it had to stand up the most, and it had held. Owen closed his eyes in the dark and let himself feel, very briefly and very privately, what the day had cost. He gave it about 3 minutes. Then he put it back in the stone, and he slept. Gary Copeland called him 3 weeks later from a pub payphone, slightly too loud, wanting to know if Owen fancied a match on Saturday. Owen said yes. Neither of them mentioned the 20th of July. They did not need to. They had been in the same city. They had both been standing somewhere. They both understood that standing was the whole of the answer, and that some things did not need a name in order to be fully and completely real. Nobody told Owen the full picture until the morning of the visit, which was itself a kind of answer. It was September 1983. The plan, announced through official channels with the confident language that official channels always used, was that a member of the royal family would make a public visit to Belfast. The wording in the brief called it a demonstration of normalcy. Owen, reading the brief in a windowless room in a building he had been driven to by a route he had not been allowed to map, thought that this was an interesting choice of words for a city where, in the past 12 months alone, more than 40 people had been killed in incidents of political violence, and where the word normal had not meant the same thing it meant in other places for well over a decade. He had been selected for the close protection detail, not the outer ring, not the crowd management cordon, but the inner detail, the 4 men who would walk within arm's reach of the principal at all times, who would be the last line before the last line, who would be asked to make decisions in fractions of seconds that other men in other jobs got days to think about. His commanding officer, a man named Colonel Frederick Haig, who had the economy of expression that comes from years of saying exactly what needs to be said and nothing more, briefed Owen in private the evening before departure. Haig told him the threat level. He used the specific word that the intelligence services used, which was severe, and he said it the way you say a word you have said many times before, and which has not lost its meaning, but which you have learned to carry without letting it alter your face. Then he told Owen something that the official brief had not included. There was a name, a man known to the intelligence services, last confirmed location, 2 streets from the planned motorcade route, 48 hours before the visit. Whether that man had moved, whether he was still in the vicinity, whether the intelligence was current or had already decayed into uselessness, Colonel Haig did not know. Owen would not be told the resolution of that information before the visit. He would be told if and when there was something concrete to act on. Owen nodded. Haig looked at him and said, "You understand what I am telling you?" Owen said, "Yes, sir." Haig said, "Then get some sleep." Owen did not sleep particularly well, but he slept enough, because he had been doing this long enough to know that a man who arrives at a difficult morning exhausted is a man who has already given something to the difficulty. He was up before 5, dressed, checked his kit, and reported to the staging area where the detail was assembling. The 4 men of the inner detail were Owen, a guardsman named Lewis Fletcher, who was 26, and had the particular quality of absolute quietness that either meant a man had nothing to say or had learned not to say the things he was thinking, and 2 others, Neil Dawson, 31, who had served 2 tours of duty in Northern Ireland in a different capacity and who moved through rooms with a subtle, continuous attention that Owen recognized from his own mirror, and a woman named Claire Weston, 29, the first female officer assigned to close protection in Owen's experience of the detail, who had a reputation for threat assessment that had preceded her into the briefing room by several weeks. Owen had met her once before this assignment. She had shaken his hand with a grip that communicated nothing except that she had done it 1,000 times and was not interested in the gesture beyond its function. The flight was short. Belfast in the early morning had a particular quality of light, gray and flat and honest, that Owen had seen in photographs but which was different in person, the way things always were. He looked at the city from the window of the vehicle as they moved through the staging debrief and tried to read it the way he had been taught to read any environment. Exits, angles, surfaces, the places where a person with a specific intention could place themselves and wait. The motorcade route had been swept. The word swept carried a weight in this context that it did not carry anywhere else. Teams had walked every inch of the planned path. Vehicles parked along the route had been checked. Buildings had been assessed. There were people on rooftops whose function was not ceremonial. Owen knew all of this. He also knew that knowing all of this was not the same as the route being safe, because a route is only as swept as its most recent sweep, and time passes, and people with specific intentions are patient. They moved out at 9:30. The streets had been prepared in the way streets are prepared for this kind of event. Barriers at intervals, a measured space between the crowd and the route, a scattering of flags and the particular controlled festivity that government coordination produces, which always looks slightly like a party that everyone has been told to enjoy. There were people on the pavements. Some of them were genuinely glad to be there. Some of them were there because they lived there and had nowhere else to be. Some of them wore expressions that Owen could not read, and those were the ones he watched. He walked. He maintained his position in the formation. He looked at everything without appearing to look at anything, which was the specific skill that close protection demanded more than any other. He watched the crowd at the level of posture and hands and weight distribution, the things that change before anything else changes, the things that the body does before the mind has finished making its decision. 40 minutes into the route, on a street where the buildings were older and closer together and the windows above the crowd level were numerous and unchecked from his angle of vision, Owen saw the window. 3rd floor. Above a chip shop, the glass caught the light at the wrong angle. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that happens to windows in old buildings all the time, the glass settling in its frame, the frame warping with age and weather. Owen knew this. He also knew that this specific kind of light catch, at this specific angle, could mean that a window that had been closed was now slightly open, and that a window slightly open in a building overlooking a motorcade route was not a detail he was allowed to file under ordinary. He did not signal. He did not break his walking pace. He did not speak into his radio, because speaking would tell anyone watching that something had changed in the detail's attention, and changing the detail's attention in a visible way was itself a risk. He looked at the window for the length of time it took him to take 3 steps. In those 3 steps he assessed what he could assess: angle from the window to the principal's position, the trajectory that anything traveling from that window would take, the time it would take the principal to clear the window's sight line at the current pace, the distance between himself and the 2 nearest positions that could provide cover. On the 4th step, he moved. Not dramatically, not in the way that would register as movement to anyone watching from the outside. He shifted 1 step to the left, placing himself fractionally between the window and the principal. He moved his hand to the principal's arm, not grabbing, just touching, guiding the pace upward by a fraction, the way you might when you see a puddle ahead and want to move around it without drawing attention to the fact that you have noticed it. They walked. The window receded behind them. Owen watched it for as long as it remained in his peripheral range. Nothing moved behind the glass. Nothing came from it. He never found out why. That was perhaps the most difficult part. Not the moment itself, which had lasted less than 10 seconds and which had required him to make several decisions simultaneously with the calm that 9 years and 1 terrible July morning had built into him like load-bearing beams in a structure. The difficult part was the after. The not knowing. The window that had caught the light wrong could have been empty, could have been a draft from a hallway, could have been someone making tea, could have been something else that the intelligence had tracked and managed before Owen even looked up. Or it could have been the man whose name he had been given the night before by Colonel Haig, a man whose confirmed location had been 2 streets away 48 hours earlier, and who had moved. Owen would never be told. That was not how this worked. You made the decision in the available seconds, you took the available action, and the outcome either validated you or it did not, and either way the rest of the route still had to be walked. Claire Weston fell into step beside him as they cleared the final approach to the venue entrance. She did not look at him. She said very quietly, in a register just above the background noise of the crowd, "I saw it too." That was all she said. Owen did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. She had seen what he had seen and made the same assessment, and they had both moved in the same fraction of a second, each from their own position, each making the same kind of silent geometry. That was the whole of close protection. You never discussed the decision while it was happening. You never needed to, because if 2 people with the same training were watching the same environment, they would see the same things at roughly the same moment and respond to them in compatible ways. The training was the conversation. Inside the venue, Owen stood at the perimeter of the room and let his attention range across exits and angles for 2 hours, while the event proceeded in the way that official events proceeded. There were speeches, there were handshakes, there were photographs taken by people on both sides of the handshakes, some of whom looked genuinely moved by the occasion, and some of whom looked like they were completing a difficult professional obligation and were glad it was nearly done. He drank a small amount of water from a bottle he had brought himself. He used the bathroom at the only available opportunity, a 2-minute window at the midpoint of the event, and he chose the stall nearest the wall because that was the habit of a man who had learned never to stand with his back to an open space if there was a choice. Louis Fletcher was waiting in the corridor when Owen came out. Fletcher had an expression that Owen had come to recognize in men who were performing the same constant labor of looking entirely ordinary while their attention was working at full capacity every second. It was not quite a smile and not quite tension. It was the specific face of a person who is all the way present and also all the way controlled. Fletcher said, "Long morning." Owen said, "They all are." Fletcher nodded and went back to his position. On the flight home, Owen sat beside Neil Dawson, and neither of them spoke for the first 40 minutes. This was comfortable. After the work of that kind of morning, silence was not absence. It was its own form of communication. It was two men who understood each other's mourning without needing to describe it. Eventually Dawson said, "Do you think it'll get better?" He was talking about Northern Ireland. He was talking about the broader situation, the political machinery that was grinding somewhere above the level at which either of them operated, the negotiations that were rumored, and denied, and rumored again. Owen looked out the window at the Irish Sea below them and thought about the question seriously, which was the only way Dawson ever expected a question to be answered. He said, "I think it depends on what you mean by better." Dawson thought about this and said, "I mean quieter." Owen said, "Yes, eventually, not soon." Dawson nodded, as though Owen had confirmed something he had already decided to believe. The plane descended toward London through cloud that was thick and low and entirely ordinary. Owen thought about the window above the chip shop. He thought about the 3 steps in which he had done the geometry, and made the decision and acted. He thought about the fact that he would never know what had been behind the glass. He decided that not knowing was the job too. The job was not just the action. The job was the living with the uncertainty on the other side of the action, the open file that never got a resolution, the question that the morning left behind when it was over and everyone was on a plane going home. He looked at the clouds and decided that he could carry an open file. He had been carrying one since 1973 and had not dropped it yet. The plane touched down. He went home. He hung up his jacket. He made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the garden, where nothing was happening, and let the long, quiet, expensive ordinariness of an evening at home do what it always did after a day like this one, remind him that ordinary was not nothing. Ordinary was what all of it had been for. His wife's name was Margaret, and she had a habit of watching him the way a person watches weather, not with alarm, but with a kind of professional attention, as though she had been reading the signs long enough to know what they meant before they arrived. They had married in 1978. He had been 29, she had been 27, and she had already been aware, at the time of the wedding, that she was not marrying a man who would tell her everything. She had accepted this the way you accept any condition that comes attached to something you want, with clear eyes and a private reckoning that she made alone and then never revisited out loud. The house in Farnham was a semi-detached brick house on a road where the cars were modest and the gardens were kept with the quiet pride of people who did not have very much but did not want anyone to know it. Owen mowed the lawn on Saturday mornings with the same regularity and the same precision with which he had stood his posts, the mower moving in straight parallel lines from one end of the grass to the other, no overlap, no missed strip. His neighbors thought he was a steady, pleasant, slightly reserved man who worked for the government in some capacity they did not ask about. This was more or less accurate. He had a daughter named Ruth, born in 1980, which meant she had been born during one of the years when the threat level in London had been high enough that Owen had spent several months working in a state of sustained and invisible alertness that he had, by then, learned to maintain without it being visible to anyone who was not specifically trained to see it. Margaret had seen it. She had not said anything about it, because there was nothing to say that would resolve it, and Margaret was not a person who spoke unless speaking would do something useful. Ruth was 4 when the Hyde Park bombings happened, old enough to notice that her father had come home from work that evening with a quality of quiet that was different from his ordinary quiet, but not old enough to have the vocabulary for the difference. She had climbed into his lap on the sofa after dinner and sat there while the news played, and Owen had let her, which was different too, because Owen was not a physical man in the ordinary domestic sense, not from coldness, but from the same professional formation that had built the wall in him. He could hold stillness for hours at a post, but a child in his lap on a sofa was a different kind of holding, and he found it harder in ways he could not explain. That evening he had held her anyway. He had kept one hand on her back and watched the news broadcast with his face doing the thing it always did during news broadcasts, which was remain entirely ordinary, and Margaret had watched him from the armchair and said nothing, which was her form of the same discipline. Those were the years Owen thought about most, later. Not the years on post, not the Belfast morning, not any of the specific days that had required a specific calibrated response. The years in Farnham were the ones that took the most from him and left the least visible mark, because the enemy those years presented was not a bomb or a window or a threat briefing. It was the long, slow difficulty of being a man who had spent over a decade training himself not to feel things in the moment, and who now lived in a house where a small girl dropped a glass in the kitchen and the sound of it sent him halfway out of his chair before his brain caught up with his body. Margaret saw it every time. He saw her see it, neither of them mentioned it. He had tried, once, to explain it. They had been sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, Ruth napping upstairs, the radio playing something orchestral in the background, and Owen had begun a sentence that he did not quite know how to finish. He said, "the training," and then he stopped, because the sentence had several possible endings, and none of them were simple enough to be useful. Margaret had looked at him across the table. She had waited, not impatiently. She was a patient woman. She had been patient with him for 7 years of marriage, and for several years of knowing him before that, and her patience was not the passive kind that waits to be thanked. It was the active kind that creates space for difficult things without making the difficulty larger by fussing at it. He tried again. He said, "They trained me to move the fear somewhere else. Not to remove it, just to move it. So it is not on my face, and not in my hands, and not anywhere that anyone can see or use. But it is somewhere. And after long enough, after doing it for long enough, I sometimes cannot find the way back to where I put it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I watch you, Owen. I have been watching you since before we were married, and I know the difference between you feeling nothing and you having put something somewhere. Most people cannot see it. I can." He looked at the table. He said, "I am sorry." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He looked at her hand on his for a long time, the way you look at something that has been there all along but which you have only now fully registered, the way a person looks at a door and suddenly understands that it has been open the whole time. He said, "Does Ruth know?" Margaret said, "She knows you love her. That is what she knows. The rest of it she will understand when she is older and when you decide it is the right time to let her understand it." He nodded. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. That was a significant moment, as significant moments in quiet marriages tend to be, unremarkable on the outside, carrying everything on the inside. The years in Farnham also taught him something that the years on post had not, or perhaps that the years on post had been teaching him all along, but which he had only been able to see from the distance of a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. The discipline he had built inside himself had been built to protect something. He had thought, in the early years, that the something was the palace, or the principle, or the integrity of the ceremony, or the broader idea of public order that the ceremony represented. And those things were real, and he did not diminish them. But the thing he had actually been protecting, all those years of stillness and stone and held faces, was ordinary life. The woman in the red coat, holding her daughter up to see the guard. The people on the streets of Belfast waving their small flags, whatever they were waving them for. The girl in his lap on the sofa in Farnham. His wife's hand on his at the kitchen table. These were the things that required a wall in front of them, not because they were fragile, but because they were specific and irreplaceable and worth the full cost of protecting. He had been thinking about this more consciously in the past year, because he was approaching the end of his time in the most active phase of his service and beginning to understand that the shape of his life was going to change. He was not afraid of the change. He was uncertain of it, which was different. He had been a specific kind of man for a long time, a man with a precise function and the training to execute that function in conditions that most people would find unbearable, and the question of who he was outside that function was one he had not spent very much time on, because inside the function there was never a moment to spare for it. Margaret was ahead of him on this, as she tended to be ahead of him on most things that required self-knowledge rather than situational awareness. She had been gently and consistently laying the ground for the next version of their life for at least 3 years before Owen had begun to consciously think about it. She had found a smaller church to attend on Sunday mornings, and she had mentioned it to him, and he had started going with her, because it was something to do on Sunday mornings that was not standing in the garden, wondering what the next week looked like. The church was unremarkable. The congregation was unremarkable. The vicar was a man named Arthur Pennell, who was perhaps 60 years old, and who gave sermons that were short and practical, and which did not demand very much, except that a person think occasionally about what mattered and why. Owen found this unexpectedly useful, not in a dramatic or transformative way, simply as a habit, a place to sit for 45 minutes and be asked a quiet question. Ruth, at 14, was in the process of becoming a person. Owen watched this with a kind of fascinated attention that he did not know how to express aloud, so he expressed it by being present, which was a thing he was good at. He drove her to school, he asked her about her day, which she answered with the economy of communication that teenagers deploy when they suspect a parent is genuinely interested and are not quite sure whether to reward the interest or deflect it. Sometimes she deflected. Sometimes, when the moment was right, she did not. One evening she asked him what he actually did at work, because she was old enough now to know that working for the government in some capacity covered a very large range of possibilities, and she wanted to narrow it down. He thought about the answer for a moment, the way he always thought about it. He said, "I stand between things that need protecting and things that might threaten them." Ruth considered this for a moment. She said, "Like a bodyguard?" He said, "Something like that, but bigger than one person." She said, "Has anything bad ever happened while you were doing it?" He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She looked back at him. She said, "And you were okay?" He said, "Yes. I was okay." She nodded, as though this was the answer she had been looking for, and went back to her homework. Owen sat at the table and felt something shift slightly behind his sternum, something that had been in a fixed position for a very long time, and which had just moved a fraction, not breaking, not falling, just adjusting slightly in its housing, as though it had decided it did not need to be held quite as tightly as it had been. He reached across and corrected a small error in her essay that she had not noticed. She thanked him without looking up. He smiled at the top of her head, briefly, in the way that parents smile at their children when the children are not watching. Margaret was at the kitchen counter and she was watching. She always was. The news had broken in April, and by May the shape of what it meant was beginning to settle through the country like a slow change in weather. The Good Friday Agreement. Owen had read the text of it not as a political document, but as a man who had been standing in the space between the campaign and the public for 26 years, and who was now reading the formal acknowledgement that the campaign was over, or at least that it was entering a different phase, one that had words and a table and signatures, rather than timing devices and coded telephone calls. He did not celebrate. He was not sure that celebration was the appropriate register for this particular fact. He sat with it quietly for several days and let it settle. What he felt, eventually, after the settling, was something close to a long exhalation. Not joy, exactly. Not relief in the familiar sense. Something larger and more tired than relief. The exhalation of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has only now recognized that the holding was over. It was 1998, and Owen Hartley was 49 years old, and he had one final ceremonial post to stand. He had known it was the last one for some weeks. The paperwork had been completed. The handover to his successor had been planned and briefed. His career in the Grenadier Guards, 26 years from the briefing room at Wellington Barracks to this last Tuesday morning in October, was ending in the way careers like his were supposed to end, without drama, with full honors, with a clean handover and a well-pressed uniform. He dressed with the same care he had always taken. The uniform took time. It always had. The bearskin, the red coat, the white gloves. He had stood at the mirror in the pre-dawn and checked each element with the same attention he had given it on his very first morning, not from sentiment, but from discipline, because a man who lets his standards drop on his last day has been letting them drop long before that and simply chose not to notice. He took the Underground from Farnham to London, which was not the way you might expect a man to travel to his final post, but which was the way Owen had always traveled when the duty allowed it, because he had never seen the point of a car when a train would do. He sat in the carriage and watched the other passengers and felt the particular quality of alertness that 26 years had made into the constant background frequency of his perception. He was watching without watching. He was reading the carriage without appearing to read it. It occurred to him, somewhere in the deep and slightly amused part of himself that had survived everything, that this was not a habit he was going to be able to simply put down at the end of the day like a tool he had finished with. It was not a professional skill at this point. It was a way of existing in the world. He was not sure this was entirely a loss. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace in October had a quality entirely its own. The trees in the park were turning, and the light was lower, and the tourists had shifted from the dense crowds of July and August to the more manageable gatherings of autumn, still significant, still drawn from every part of the world, but with more room between them, more open air, a different texture. Owen walked to his post at the eastern sentry box and stood in the place he had been standing, on and off, for 26 years, and looked out at the crowd and felt the ground under his boots with the specific attention of a person who is noting a thing for the last time. He set his face. The morning proceeded. The crowd gathered in its ordinary way. Cameras were produced. Children were lifted. A school group from somewhere in the Midlands arranged itself behind the railings with the managed chaos of 25 12-year-olds under the supervision of 2 teachers who looked as though the morning had already been longer than they had planned for. A tourist couple with matching waterproof jackets took turns photographing each other in front of the sentry box with Owen as the background, which was something he had observed happening thousands of times and which had long since ceased to register as remarkable. The boy arrived at the railings at approximately 10:30. He was perhaps 10 years old, small for his age, with the kind of bright-eyed, absolute certainty of a child who had come to the railings with a specific plan and was not going to leave until it had been executed. He worked his way to the front of the crowd with the cheerful determination of a person who has not yet learned that public spaces require a certain deference to others, and he stood at the railings directly in front of Owen's post and looked up with the focused assessment of a small scientist examining an interesting specimen. He waved, a very confident wave, the kind that clearly expected a result. Owen looked above his head at the middle distance. The boy waved again, larger this time, in case the first wave had been insufficiently visible. Owen did not move. The boy put both hands on the railings and leaned in as far as the barrier would allow. He said something. Owen was too far away to hear it clearly, but the shape of the words suggested either an introduction or a question, possibly both simultaneously. Owen held his gaze at the middle distance. His face gave nothing. The boy looked back at his parents, who were standing several feet behind him, and he communicated something to them through a gesture that involved both hands and a shrug. His father laughed. His mother said something that was evidently encouragement, because the boy turned back to the railings with renewed purpose. He tried a salute. He tried it with both hands simultaneously, which is not technically how a salute works, but which showed a commitment to improvisation that Owen appreciated, in the part of himself that was below the stone. Owen held his post. A child near the boy, a girl perhaps a year older, told him something. The boy listened to her, with the expression of a person who is receiving professional advice. She pointed at Owen and said something else. The boy nodded. He reached into his pocket and produced a coin, which he bent down and placed very precisely on the toe of Owen's boot. The crowd nearby laughed. A few people filmed it on their cameras. Owen looked at the middle distance. Inside his white gloves, his hands were completely still. He was thinking, in the quiet channel that ran beneath everything, about the first morning he had ever stood this post, in 1973, when a girl of 4 had waved at him with a small energetic arm, and he had given her nothing, and her mother had said something in a language he did not recognize, and the girl had looked at him with the serious expression of a child trying to solve a puzzle. He was thinking about 26 years as a single unit of time, and about what it meant to stand in the same place for that long. Not the same physical spot, but the same position between the world and the thing the world needed protecting. He was thinking about a window above a chip shop, and a woman crying at railings, and a man named Gary Copeland calling from a pub payphone, and Colonel Frederick Haig saying get some sleep, and his daughter Ruth asking, and you were okay. He was thinking about all of it the way you think about something when you are standing at the end of it, when the reckoning is finally available because there are no more seconds of the thing to attend to, when the whole shape of it can finally be seen from the position of having cleared it. And behind all of that, underneath the stone and the stillness and the 26 years of everything he had kept off his face, Owen Hartley was thinking it was worth it. Every morning, every post, every afternoon in Farnham, wondering who he was outside the uniform, every Sunday at the small church asking a quiet question, every time Ruth had looked up from her homework, every time Margaret had watched him from across the table, every time the crowd at the railings had needed the man at the gate to look like nothing in the world could move him, it had been worth it. The relief came at 11. Owen heard the approaching footsteps of the relief guard and felt the formal transfer of attention that marked the end of a post, the sequence of movements and words that had been performed by British guards for longer than any of them could personally account for, the handover that was less a beginning and an ending and more a continuation, one man stepping into the place another had occupied, the position itself remaining constant while the people inside it changed. When it was complete, when the formal exchange was done, and Owen's final post was officially, procedurally, irreversibly over, he did not move immediately. He stood at the edge of the forecourt for a moment and let the morning be what it was: autumn light, the sound of the city beyond the park, the smell of leaves and diesel, and the particular city air that had been the background of his working life for most of his adult years. The boy was still there. He had moved a little way along the railings from Owen's old position, and he was now watching the new guard with the same patient, experimental energy with which he had watched Owen. He had his coin back in his hand, Owen noticed, and was likely preparing to deploy it again. The boy's father was calling to him now, something about time, something about lunch, and the boy was clearly negotiating some extension on the grounds that the new guard had not yet been properly tested. Owen watched this transaction with the attention he gave all transactions between children and their parents, which was the specific attention of a man who had missed a significant quantity of those transactions with his own daughter due to the demands of his professional life, and who had come to regard other people's as a kind of retrospective correction. The boy's father was firm but not unkind. The boy looked at the new guard one last time, apparently decided that the negotiating position was not strong enough, and turned away from the railings. He turned and found Owen standing 10 feet away, in his civilian coat and hat, watching him. The boy looked at Owen with an expression of concentrated scrutiny. He looked at him the way a person looks at someone they recognize from somewhere but cannot quite place. Then something crossed the boy's face that Owen interpreted as, "You look familiar, but different. You look like a person." The boy looked at him for another moment, curious and open in the way children are before the world teaches them caution, and then he smiled, a full, uncomplicated 10-year-old smile, the kind that does not have any complexity behind it, the kind that is simply, "I see you, hello." Owen felt his face do something it had not done at that post in 26 years. Not a performance, not a signal, not a response calculated to communicate anything tactical or symbolic or controlled. It happened the way things happen when you stop holding them back. It was small, it cost nothing, it went from the inside out in a direction that was exactly the reverse of all his training, and it arrived on his face as the simplest possible thing. He smiled back. The boy's whole face changed. He looked, suddenly, as though he had won a prize he had not expected to win, as though he had been working on a puzzle for the entire morning and the solution had arrived in a way he had not anticipated. He looked back at his parents, pointing at Owen with an insistence that said, "Did you see that? Did you see it?" His mother had seen it. She was smiling too, with the weary, fond expression of a woman who had spent the morning watching her son conduct an investigation into the limits of protocol and who was now witnessing the unexpected result. The boy's father was reaching for his hand now, and the family was moving toward the gate, and the boy went with them but kept turning back to look at Owen as he went, as though he needed to confirm several more times that it had really happened, that the man who had been immovable for all the preceding minutes had turned out to have a face after all. Owen watched them go. He stood on the forecourt for a moment more, alone in the way that is not loneliness, but is simply the particular spaciousness of a thing that is complete. He put his hands in the pockets of his civilian coat and looked at the October sky above the palace and thought about what had just passed between himself and a 10-year-old boy he would never see again. He had given the boy nothing all morning. He had held every line and kept every professional distance and executed the duty the way it was supposed to be executed, and then the duty had ended and he had let his face do what it wanted, and the boy had beamed back at him as though he had won something. Owen thought, maybe he had. Maybe that was what it had all been for, in the end. Not only the large things, not only the Hyde Park morning, or the Belfast route, or the years of standing between the world and what it needed to remain intact. Those things were true and significant, and he did not diminish them. But also the small things. The woman in the red coat and the coin on his boot, and the girl who had waved at him in 1973, who was probably 25 years old by now and did not remember it. The 10-year-old boy who would go home tonight and tell someone about the guard who, at the very end, had finally smiled. The guards were for the palace. The stillness was for the people. And the smile, he thought, the smile that came after, the one that cost 26 years to earn, that was for the boy, and for himself. And for all the versions of himself that had stood in the same place, and kept everything inside, and let nothing show, and done the job required to be done. Owen Hartley walked out through the gate, and onto the mall. The city moved around him in its ordinary way, indifferent, and endless, and completely alive. He pulled his coat a little closer against the October air. He had a train to catch. Margaret was cooking Sunday dinner. Ruth had said she might come down from London if the trains were running well. Arthur Pennell had a short sermon prepared that would ask a quiet question and then leave it alone. He walked toward the underground station at a pace that was slightly easier than his usual pace, a pace that did not have any professional purpose behind it, a pace that was simply a man walking through his city on an autumn morning in 1998 with nowhere urgent to be and every reason in the world to take his time getting there. Behind him, the guard at the gate stood without moving. The crowd at the railings gathered and looked and photographed. The ceremony held. The wall stood, as it always had, and the man who had been the wall for 26 years walked home.